We'll turn the time to, who are we turning the time to?
You can turn it to me.
Whatever, lady, sounds good.
I'd like to welcome everyone that's here for this portion of the meeting. We first are going to do a quick introduction of those who are on the commission. And when I say your name, if you go ahead and stand so that they know who's who. Jordan Stevenson and Brock Thane, Alan Farnes, and Patrick Hine. And then we've got a few more that might come later, and that's Sean Chilcote and John Lovelace. Okay, so real quick, when we first started meeting, we had our first meeting in February 7th. We have the first Tuesday of every month that we meet. And the thing that was so neat about the people that have been selected to be on this commission is the knowledge and understanding that they have for the needs of what we were looking at for making decisions, not decisions, but recommendations to the council. And on our commission, we have engineers, we have accountants, we have people that are involved in the solar industry, we have somebody who actually is working for Bountiful Electric. So we have a really, really good group that has brought a great wealth of knowledge to what the presentation will give us tonight. When we had our first meeting, we decided we would do a mission statement, and I'm going to read that mission statement. Kaysville Power and Light's mission is to provide reliable electricity with superior customer service at a competitive price to the residents and businesses in Kaysville City. And I like that because that is what we need to have happen. And so tonight, the presentation that is going to be shown was put together. Jordan Stevenson and then Brock Thane. Everyone had input on it. And so as they go through it, feel free to ask questions. There's a lot of numbers that we're going to talk about. If you need them to go back and say something again, please let them know. They want to make sure that we have as good of an understanding what we're going to be deciding on. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jordan.
We got this clicker plugged in here. If not, Dean, you might be the designated clicker. Sorry. Yeah, so we'll let Dean steer. Is that all right? Got it. Okay, thank you. Sorry. Okay. Sorry, what's that?
I think you did it.
Oh, we're up. Okay, thanks. All right, Susan talked a little bit about this, so I don't want to be too redundant, but just to introduce myself, I'm Jordan Stevenson. By trade, I'm a CPA. I work in the utility industry as a regulatory affairs analyst is what it's called, but it's really a lot to do with utility pricing. I do most of my work in the gas utility sector, but I found that a lot of the ideas are applicable to water, electric, other things. So the principles are pretty consistent with what I've done in my career. So it's been great to learn more about the electric side of things. But Susan already went over some of our background. One thing that happened before this timeline starts is we, about a year ago, had another company in Utility Financial Solutions that had brought forward a proposal that you probably remember. And we started off with that proposal. And so I just want to describe kind of what our attempt was as we went forward with that. So as Susan said, we came up with a mission statement that we hope will guide our decision-making as a board, and especially as it relates to this study and the rates. And Susan read that already. And then we came up with a framework to try to analyze this proposal that had been brought forward. And the goal of the framework was to determine a few things, but first we wanted to decide if the level of cost that was being proposed for the new fee on solar customers was reasonable. And the next step was we wanted to decide if the structure of the fee was the most prudent thing to do and was most fair for different perspectives. And so we developed a framework to try to analyze that, and that's what I'm going to go over tonight and the results of that study. Around June 6th, we presented that model, the framework that we would use to determine if these rates were proper. On June 27th, we had finished up the residential class and brought forward proposals, well, not specific proposals, but the results of that framework after it had been applied. Through August, we added commercial and industrial classes to the model as well. And then in September, we finalized what we thought the results of the model should be and voted on it, and it was unanimously approved by us to bring to you for your input as well. So that's kind of our history. And October 3rd, we had some additional discussion on the schedule and how we think the transition could occur. And so that's what we will present to you this evening. So I'm going to talk about the framework. And in making rates for utilities, there's three main steps that we'll talk about. One is determining what the total revenue requirement of the utility should be. And I apologize, it's a little small up here, but the revenue requirement, I like to think of it as the total pie that we're trying to go after. And so how much revenue does the utility need to meet its obligations in its current operations, and then looking forward for future capital expenditures or repayment of debt and those kind of things. Step two is to determine what the cost of service is for different customer classes. So now we're taking that total pie and we're trying to decide how to divvy it out to specific customer classes. And then the final step is the actual rates to collect that cost of service from different classes. And so, as I said, we've got the pie over here, and then we're splitting it up to different customer classes. And then the rate design could be flat rates for everybody, like our cable bill might be, or it could be based on usage, like currently our utility rates are, a mixture of those things. And so we've discussed all of those things, and we'll get into those particulars tonight. And so, as I said, we'll go through each of these steps. So step one, we've got operating expenses. We relied on the city financial statements to determine what the operating expenses have been. We forecasted modest amounts of inflation based on industry materials, and we also looked at trends and things of costs that were going away to try to come up with what we call it a test period. So we're setting rates not for 2015 or 2016, but for 2018 at this point. So we're trying to look ahead and not decide what we should have collected in 2016, but we're looking ahead to 2018 to try to see what conditions will look like. So we've got operating expenses, admin, any kind of debt requirements, and then included also is depreciation and other capital needs to come up with that total pie that we looked at. Once we determine what the total revenue requirement will be, then we get into steps 2 and 3, which is coming up with the cost of service and the rate design. And so what we want to do is, so we've got one way of looking at costs, and that's the financial statements. The next way of looking at costs, I call it functionalization. So what functions is the utility doing that's driving those costs? And for electric utility, we have functionalized it into 3 main categories. We have generation, which is obviously the generation of electricity. We've got transmission, which will bring that generated electricity to our city through transmission lines. And we have finally the distribution, which is everything from our substations to the meter of the home, all of that infrastructure and expenses that go into that category. And it's important for us to understand these functions because then we can get into how the costs actually behave. And that's how we want to design the bill, is to reflect real underlying cost behavior. So customers have the right idea of, if I increase my usage in this way, costs are either going up or costs are going down, and so we're sending the right signal. So we went through each of these categories and discussed how costs really behave. And so starting with generation, we've split it into variable costs and fixed costs. And we're getting back into kind of our economics classes a little bit, or accounting. And for variable, we asked what kind of costs in our generation would be variable, meaning if a customer increases their kilowatt hour usage by 1, are there costs that go up as a result of that? Or do they go down as they decrease? And this is kind of our hypothetical process here, but then we'll get into the real numbers in a minute. And so on generation, we've found that energy usage drives some of these costs and the variable costs. For example, fuel to generate the electricity would be required when customers demand more energy and use more kilowatt hours. And if you have any questions or comments as we go, feel free to jump in. And if I say anything wrong, I'll turn to the fellow board members up here. Feel free to stop me. So that's an example of a variable cost. We also have fixed costs. Another term for fixed costs is long-run variable costs. And so our rates not only collect just what's variable this year, but in the long run, we'll have to replace infrastructure. We'll have to replace the contracts that we currently have with UAMPS. And so how do these long-run variable costs behave as well? And they are also driven in part by total energy usage, but not fully. So we have to introduce a new cost driver at this point, which is peak demand. And this is a concept that's critical to understand to design your rates properly and have the right incentives. But I like to use the example of a bus. If I need to drive a bus to carry, say, we'll pick 24 people because there's 24 hours in the day. If I'm taking one person every hour, I only need one passenger seat. So I could actually just have a 2-seat sedan and I'd be okay. But if I have 20 passengers at 5 p.m., because that's when they get off work, then I need to have a larger bus that would allow 19 passengers and myself. And so peak demand is similar. We have to size the system in order to accommodate the peak. And even though the rest of the time we may not require that, that's what's driving a lot of the decisions. So our fixed cost is kind of shared between the total output and the peak output. And so we need to decide how much we allocate to the total energy that will be on the bill and the peak-related energy. And so we did that based on what's called a load factor. And I can talk a little bit more about that calculation later on if anyone is that interested. But we also have the model here on Brock's computer, an Excel model that we're happy to open up as well and get into as much detail as anyone would like to see. So moving on to the transmission, we did the same kind of analysis, variable versus fixed. This is just kind of an example. Same kind of split applies where you have total energy that's driving that infrastructure, and you also have the peak demand that you have to worry about. And so we're sharing the costs there. And then finally, the distribution is everything from the substation to the meter. And we have similar problems there, except for there's one more bucket that we have to add, and that's our customers. And there's certain costs related to having a customer that have nothing to do with how much power they use. For example, customer service and sending them a bill, and even just putting a meter on their house. Those things vary by customers, but they don't vary by usage. And so one additional customer will cause our customer costs to go up, but usage doesn't apply in this case. And so we've categorized costs into a customer bucket, and then we'd want to design our bill to reflect that behavior. And so in this case, all three buckets apply to our distribution costs. And then finally, when we have all of our revenue requirement pie functionalized by generation, transmission, and distribution, and then allocated to what drives the actual costs, we can design a bill that reflects the cost behavior that underlies it. And so for the energy costs that vary by how much kilowatt hours people use, we can then come up with a kilowatt hour rate. Currently in Kaysville, all of our bill goes through a kilowatt hour rate, even though some of the underlying costs don't apply to the kilowatt hour rate, if that makes sense. We can also come up with a mechanism that sends a peak signal. For example, between 5 and 9 p.m., we historically have had our coincident peak on the system, and you'll see later on that we would recommend having kind of a time of use signal that allows customers to save even more money by reducing the peak usage and have the appropriate signal there. And then finally, the customer charge would simply be a basic monthly service fee that doesn't vary by usage. And so that's kind of the framework that we sought to utilize, and I'll get ahead to the results. But just to walk through a little bit more how this applies to solar or an average typical customer, I have a little example here. So here on the y-axis, we have kilowatt hour usage. On the x-axis, you have the time of day. And an average customer or a typical customer in Kaysville will look like this. This is just me drawing it. This isn't an actual numbers behind this, but we wanted to show the concept here. In the morning, the usage goes up a little bit, and then in the middle of the day, we see usage decline, and then there in the evening, there's a peak in kilowatt hour usage. And that peak happens to be in the coincident peak of the system. And so when we talk about the bus, we're sizing our system around, that's what's driving that decision, is that coincident peak. Now, a customer could reduce their total usage, but not reduce the peak. And in that case, we would want to see the bill reduced for the energy-related costs, but the peak costs would remain the same, and so the billing for that component would remain the same. Does that make sense? And vice versa, a customer could reduce the peak and maybe raise other energy demand during the day and have kind of a more level load. And if we have the right billing structure, then that would just flow right through on the monthly bill. Let's talk about what a solar customer looks like. This is just an example. Again, I just kind of drew this out here to get the concept. But a solar customer, when the sun's not shining yet in the morning, they're just kind of following what an average customer looks like. And then there in the middle of the day, you see the production peak where the sun's shining and they're producing a lot of energy. And they'll dip even into where they're feeding back onto the system. And that's what that big dip down here is representing. But then as the sun goes down, and depending on how the solar array's positioned, you may see some customers come back up and are using right around what the typical customer is using in the peak portion of the day. And so in that case, we could see that they could offset all of their kilowatt hour usage by producing energy, yet still we need the same size bus because the coincident level hasn't gone down. And so when we talk about is there kind of a subsidy issue, are customers paying what they should be paying, if we have the costs identified appropriately, we can see how much costs are we really saving as a utility, and are we paying enough for the solar, or are we paying too much? And so that's kind of the framework there in discussing that. So just going through this scenario where a customer produces that kind of solar energy, we would see that the variable costs related to generation, we can avoid that. And so we don't mind having the bill reduced for that. On the fixed costs, for the portion we allocate to total energy, it would be reduced, but that related to peak, oh, I've got arrows coming on there, but that related to peak would be unchanged. So you wouldn't want to see the bill go down and give a credit for the costs that actually don't go anywhere. And so our idea as a power board is we wanted this to be cost-based. And so if the underlying costs behave in a certain way, that's how it should be reflected on the bill. One thing I will point out is that there are other concerns that might be important to the community, to the council, that aren't necessarily captured on income statement, and those things we haven't considered in this analysis. And it's hard to quantify those things, and so I would just put that out there. But that's those kind of things. This is all accounting-driven, cost-based analysis. So on the transmission, we continue on. We could avoid the energy-related piece, and the peak piece would not be avoided. And then finally on distribution, all of these costs would remain unchanged simply because the distribution grid is required to receive the energy from those solar panels. So there's no avoided cost from the substation on. So that's kind of our example. Yeah.
Just one question on that. And the reason why that is because of peak demand. It's the bus principle, right? Even on the generation plants, you're not really reducing the amount of generation capacity you have to have, because at peak demand, you still need all of that production, the solar.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly. Now there are ways to reduce peak demand, and so if our rates are set in such a way to send the right cost signal, then we actually incentivize the right behavior that would reduce that peak demand, such as a battery that could be used during the evening. So, all right, any other comments, questions? I think we're about ready to talk about the actual numbers here. So let's talk about the results. So step one was the revenue requirement, the total pie, if you will. For our ongoing operations, we estimate we need $14.06 million, a long-term capital plan, $0.36 million, and then we looked at the cash reserve policy, and to get where we think we want to be is $0.28 million, and we have a total revenue requirement at the utility of $14.7 million. To functionalize that, we put it into the categories we discussed. Generation and transmission was pretty easy because it all is just coming from UAMPS in a single line item on our financial statements, and that'll be $9.67 million based on forecasts directly from UAMPS. And then the distribution related is $3.91 million, and then the customer related items that don't vary by usage ended up being $1.12 million for your $14.7 million. Again, so we're taking the pie, we're functionalizing it based on those three categories, and then we can talk about how those costs behave. So continuing on here, the generation of $9.67 million from UAMPS, we split into fixed and variable, and we have 44% of the bill which is fixed, which is actually convenient too, because UAMPS each month calls out the percentage of fixed costs in the bill. So it was pretty easy to analyze that. And then the production related items are 56%. So we've got $4.26 million here on the left of fixed. And like I said before, some of that's related to peak, and some of that is related to total energy required. And the 62%, the formula we use to come up with that distinction is what is our average hour of demand in Kaysville over our peak hour demand in Kaysville. So in any given hour, our demand is 38% of what our peak demand is. And that's called the load factor. And it's a common ratio used in the industry to allocate these types of costs. So that's where the 62% comes from. So that'll go into our peak bucket. Over here on the variable cost side, all of that is related to total energy. So there's no allocation we need to do there. And just to sum it down here at the bottom, we end up with peak-related costs of $2.64 million and our total energy-related costs of $7.03 million. So that's the generation and transmission piece. And then we have the distribution piece. We've got $5.03 million left over in our revenue requirement to get up to $14.7 million total. We've got $0.93 related to peak demand items, and then $2.98 million related to energy. You'll notice those do not sum up to the 5.03 because we have to add that new driver, which I'll pull on here in a sec. But once again, the fixed costs we're splitting up, or not fixed, but peak related. in this case. We're splitting up based on the load factor. And then the total energy-related items all go to the energy bucket. And then finally I'll bring on, and then we're summing it up down here. But then we've got to bring on that customer-related item that doesn't vary by usage, whether peak or total usage, but varies by customer count on the system, and that's 1.12 million. A lot of numbers I'm throwing out. I apologize, but we just wanted to make sure all the info is out there and how we came up with the final recommendation. So the 1.12 million, like I said, it's driven by customer count. It includes the items such as the meter, the service line to the meter, billing, customer service, meter reading, those types of things. And in the end, this is what that looks like broken out by each of our customer classes, just to give an idea of how we broke that up. So in summary, we have total peak-related costs of $3.22 million, total energy-related costs of $10.4 million, our customer-related costs of $1.07, and that is how we come up with the cost driver buckets. It all totals up to our total revenue requirement, again, of $14.7 million. Now we're at a point where we can design an actual bill because we see what drives each of these costs. So we allocate each of these costs to customer classes based on that class's contribution to the cost driver. So if total kilowatt hours are driving the 10.4 million of energy-related costs, we can allocate that to commercial customers based on their total kilowatt hour usage, and to residential customers is based on their usage, and so on and so forth. So after doing all that, here's the final results of our cost of service by class. You can see our residential class carries the largest load at $9.5 million. Commercial down on the total line is $4.5 million. And then we've got industrial and lighting, which brings in smaller amounts of revenue there, totaling up to the 14.7 amount that we need to collect. And then we've also got those categorized into the cost drivers, energy, peak, and customer related. Now we can get into the specific rate design. And ultimately, what we would recommend is a time of use type rate design, and that's for to be able to give that peak signal. The problem today is that we don't have a technology to measure the hourly use yet, but it is on the agenda to discuss AMI metering, which not only gives us this billing capability, but other operational capabilities that I'm sure we'll discuss more as that conversation comes. But once that's available, we would take the total energy-related costs over the amount of energy that will be used to come up with a total energy rate of 6.7 cents. We would take the solar credit and calculate the same thing, only this time we'd exclude the distribution piece, which can't be avoided in the energy cost, just going back to the buckets. And then we have our peak-related costs, $3.22 million. We'd look at how much we anticipate billing during that peak hour, 5 to 9 p.m. It's 26.7 million kilowatt hours over the year, and so we'd have a peak rate of 7.7 cents, and that would just be an added rate at that time. And then the solar customers who actually backfeed during the peak would also have that added value of what the peak value brings. And then finally, we have a customer charge of $8. So in the long run, and we anticipate this being 2 to 3 years, that's where we would recommend going. And these rates are what we calculate today, but the structure is what we recommend going to in the long run. And obviously, as we update for the utility financial performance and different things, those are subject to change when that time comes. But we wanted to give an idea for what that looks like.
Can I ask you one quick question just about that?
Yes.
You mentioned the 6.3 cents additional solar credit during peak time. Do you anticipate that there would be as I remember your graphic, it didn't look like there was a whole lot of crossover between peak times and solar. So would that be a relatively minimal stretch of time where it might be applicable?
At this point, I think so. It might be better for Brock to discuss the solar patterns, but I believe there are solar customers who are producing late into that peak window. Whether or not it completely backfeeds and offsets their own usage, I'm not sure.
No question.
But we see technology changing. Batteries costs continue to drop, and what this could provide customers an opportunity to do is store energy during the middle of the day and then provide that back to the grid during that peak time. Where currently they don't have much of an incentive to care about doing that. This would give kind of an economic opportunity to do those kind of solutions. So,
excellent. Thank you.
any other questions on that? All right, I'll move forward to kind of we call it our Schedule A, which is between today and when AMI is available. There's a period of time where we don't have the technology to do the time of use rates. So based on our current structure, we calculate rates at 8.6 cents for everything up to 1,000 kilowatt hours. And then all over kilowatt hours is 9.7 cents. And then the customer charge remains the same. And this results in a $3.37 per month impact on typical customers, or around 4%. And that's not driven by any kind of rate structure change. That's just simply costs to fund the utility based on most recent analysis of how the performance of the utility is. And for the solar credit, it would be 6.6 cents for future customers. And we have a recommendation on how to transition that we'll discuss in more detail in a slide coming up. But just to give an idea you see that 6.6 cents is less than where we were at doing just a full retail rate credit, and that represents the unavoided costs of solar when the solar is backfeeding. And this would be a 5% decrease in the total annual solar credit for a typical average solar customer versus where we are today. And then I put in here the sentence that we actually recommend no change for current solar customers until 2033. That's a 15-year time frame that we feel gives ample opportunity for a payback based on calculations that were made when solar was purchased. So most of our solar customers have purchased their solar panels in the last year and a half. It's just grown exponentially, and so I think most customers are around that time frame and that payback period. Just to get a little bit more detail into that, so if the commission or the council were to approve this proposal and say the effective date's January 1, 2018, we would move to Schedule A, and there would be that 4% increase on the typical customer's bill. And then when AMI becomes available and we move towards a time of use type rate, the idea is that there is no change if you're an average customer. So going to time of use shouldn't, if your use pattern is average and you use about in the peak what the average customer uses, going to time of use is a neutral billing impact. So that's the idea, is that I, as a customer, won't notice a difference based on time of use unless I use a lot more in the peak time than the average customer uses, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So
can I ask you one more question?
Yeah.
The number that you came up with for the long-term capital investment, did that include the deployment of AMI throughout the city?
Yeah, that included that number. Yep.
Okay.
Let's talk about the solar impact. So going to Schedule A, like we said, current customers as of today that already have solar will remain on the current rate system until 2033. So there's really no impact to current customers. Going forward, if this were to become effective January 1, 2018, we'd recommend that be kind of the line in the sand. Future customers at that point are on Schedule A, which is the 6.6 cent solar compensation, and then subject to the time of use plan once it is available in 2 to 3 years. And that's just what this is saying. The impact on current typical solar customers would be that their back-fed credit would go from $833 today to $659 when time of use is implemented. And so if I have a 7 kilowatt system on my roof today, I'm generating about enough power to get $833 of value for my solar, and that goes to $659 after time of use is implemented, if that makes sense. But that only applies to future customers. And that leads to kind of the final recommendation is that we would provide a bill calculator going forward as soon as this is approved, if it is approved, that allows customers who are determining whether or not to install solar the ability to see what their bill would look like under time of use and what it would look like under Schedule A, so that there's no ambiguity about how that impacts the economics of the decision. So,
hey, just a question. How close does this mirror Rocky Mountains and the Public Service Commission, what they did with their solar over the last 30 days? Is it similar, or are you approaching it a little bit different?
It's a little different. Brock may be better to discuss that docket if you want to step up. Yeah.
So, Brock Thane, I'm a PE electrical engineer by trade and work in the renewable energy sector. Just a couple things, specifically on Rocky Mountain Power's changes. One thing that they did that's a little different than what we're showing here is on the grandfathering. We're recommending 15-year grandfathering. They are implementing an additional 3 years of grandfathering for all customers. And keep in mind that we are picking a date and saying January 1st is when this is, we're assuming that this would start in January 1st, realizing that, some of our recommendations may take a little bit longer to implement. So just use that for a rule of thumb and realize that it may take a little longer. The other piece that they did is the value is a little bit different. And can I see your clicker? 1 second. Let me just step back. So, and I wanted to make a little bit of a clarification on this value here, which is the solar credit. And to when we studied this, we looked at a lot of other utilities that were looking, to implement net metering, right? This value of this credit is a little bit lower in Kaysville, but that's also because we've applied the demographics of Kaysville. So Rocky Mountain Power, they have more commercial or they may have more industrial. So we are slightly lower of what we determine the value of solar is, but that's just because it's specific to more residential. That's correct. But what I did want to note is this credit, when they receive that derated value back, that is only when they have a surplus. So anytime that anyone with solar is offsetting their current loads, then they would receive essentially a 1-to-1 credit. This would be only if we sent it back onto the distribution and into the network. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question?
Brock, is that the case, to Councilmember Page's question, is that the case with Rocky Mountain, that it's a 1-to-1 credit if they're just using, or is there's a fixed credit regardless of, am I making sense?
Yep. Yep. So they in Rocky Mountain Power's ruling, what they approved was they approved a 1-to-1 if it was offsetting your load, and then what they did, if you'll back up just one more for me, please. What they did is, if you see the blended average of 8.613 plus 97.1 or 9.717, they blend that together, and then they times that by, for residential, they times it by 92% of the value. So they would say that the average of 86 and 97, or 9.7, 8.6 and 9.7, it's valued for current customers, for the next 3 years in a transitional period, its value is 92%. So if you take the 6.6, and I'll calculate it here, and I'll bring that number up, but the 6.6 divided by the average of 8.6 and 9.7, you're going to see that we are lower than the 92%.
92% of their blend of their
That's
average.
Right.
Okay.
That's right.
Thanks.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Brock, but I believe Rocky Mountain Power's current proposal is good through 2020, and then the commission will recommend a new solar plan going forward after that, right?
Yeah, so what's going to happen is anybody in Rocky Mountain Power through November 15th will be considered a grandfathered period. So everything prior to November 15th, 2017 will get grandfathered for 18 years. Then what will happen is they do what's called a transition. For the next 3 years, anybody that signs on will get a sliding scale of 15-year grandfathering. So if you signed on November 16th, 2017, you would get plus 15 years. If you did a year after that, you would get 14 years grandfathering. Meanwhile, what they're doing is they are doing a study in that 3-year transition, and what they're determining in that 3-wait while other customers on board.
I see.
So the 3-year sliding period is the 92% that Brock talked about, and then in 2020, I'd anticipate it to be different. We'll see what it ends up
My
being, right?
anticipation is that it'll be very similar to this, and only the avoided costs that you can actually avoid.
Excellent.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, we talked about this. Then moving on to commercial A. So one thing we noticed when we were designing our rates is that the customer charge and the demand charge was a little difficult to design for all of our commercial customers, just because we have such a wide varying degree of customers. And so we've split it up into more of a small commercial, a mid-commercial, and then a large commercial class. And so the commercial A group is all those customers who use up to 9 kilowatts of demand. And I'll just throw the rates up here. Won't have to read them all. The structure is very similar to what we currently have today. And then we would implement a customer charge of $11 per month. And then on this class, there wouldn't be a demand charge. And a demand charge, just so that we're clear, is we would have a 15-minute interval of measured energy, and the highest 15 minutes during that month would be assessed a demand charge, if that makes sense. It's a little different than residential. The reason being because a lot of the costs the utility incurs to serve those commercial customers is driven by that spike in energy needs during that 15-minute interval, whereas residential customers don't have as much of that spike going on. And if you have any questions on that, Bruce Rigby is probably better to discuss the demand charges, or either any of you guys. And this would result in a 3 to 5% impact on the typical customer, very similar to the residential class. I have a little bit of a range there just because there's more variance in the class of commercial customers, but it would be very similar to the residential customer class. Moving on to the commercial B group, same kind of things. This time the customer charge would be $13, and we'd implement a demand charge in this class of $11.59. And then it's the same kind of impact on a commercial customer. And then finally, the largest customers, anything above 38 kilowatts of demand, and our customer charge goes to $59 per month, and the demand charge is $11.59 through 2018, and then we would recommend going to full cost in 2019. Now, the reason why there's a step in this one is because currently, if we were just to go to full cost on this customer class, there would be larger impact to these customers than the 4 to 5%. So we recommend doing it in 2 steps, and it keeps all customers kind of marching forward at the same pace of that 4 to 5% range. And then in 2019, as it moves to full cost, it'd be another step at that point. And finally, our industrial class, we are recommending a 3.3 cent kilowatt hour rate, a customer charge of $90. That seems very high. If you look at the total bill on a monthly basis, $90 really isn't a large percentage of the bill. So just keep that in mind. There's so much kilowatt hour usage going on that's what drives the majority of the bill. And then the power charge, we had a similar circumstance with the industrial customer in Kaysville where full cost is a ways away at this point. So we have a 3-step process of $9 beginning in 2018, and then it moves up to $11, and then finally full cost, whatever that is in 2020 currently is $13.28. But that again keeps us at the same pace of impact on our customers of around 5% for the industrial customer. Just to summarize here, all of the proposals we brought today include these new rates that you saw for residential, commercial, and industrial customers. From a policy standpoint, we recommend a Schedule A with a transition period until AMI is available. We propose grandfathering current solar customers until 2033, meaning rates don't change if you have solar panels on your roof today until 2033, at which point you would then just adopt the rate schedule that is in place at that time for customers. And all future solar customers that enroll after the effective date would be on Schedule A and eventually the time of use rates. And then finally, we propose creating a bill calculator, maybe having it published on the website somewhere where customers can see exactly how their bills will be impacted by this transition period as we go forward. And then I'm going to turn this back over to Brock to talk about what we're doing looking ahead, and then we'll have time for questions for a few minutes.
Thank you. So a couple things that I just wanted to walk you guys through just at the end here is definitely want to walk you through our next steps and what we'd like to see happen, but also just kind of to walk you through just some thoughts from sitting where you guys are sitting right now, getting fed with a bunch of information. I understand that it's a lot of numbers, and we do welcome, as Jordan mentioned, the model, reviewing the model. It was really important to all of us, one, to determine the mission statement, but then also to show you the facts, right? These are the facts, these are the numbers, and I'll mimic that there are other benefits that we have not included. We just are showing you the numbers. I think the one thing that I will just walk through that was big for me, being an engineer, working in power distribution, working in solar, one of the things that I didn't understand was the demand piece. And I understood it, but I didn't understand that Jordan used the definition of the bus, right? I think the key to remember today is when we're buying that bus is a bus we're buying for the next 20 years, and we are tied in for the next 20 years. So that is some things that I want you to realize that this is going to be an ongoing thing, that we have to keep studying this as we move forward. But, we are fixed on some of these contracts for as long as 20 years. So that was one thing that, was a shock to me when I was wondering why all these changes couldn't be implemented from the utility side. So some other things I just wanted you guys to know that we are working on. is the size of the solar. How much solar will we allow to go onto the grid? The fees associated with interconnect and what type of inverters can interconnect, to make sure that the grid is stable. Commercial and industrial, what are we going to do for commercial customers or industrial customers that want to implement solar? So those are big things that we're looking at. Jordan's really talked about AMI. What I can tell you is there are a lot of changes coming. It's exciting, but it also needs to make sure that we have a plan, right? The number one thing that we didn't want to do is have stranded capital. We've all invested in this, and we wanted to make sure that we're looking at those things correctly. So some things that we're looking at is a study. Every time an interconnection comes onto the grid, we want to make sure that the grid's studied and the impacts are determined. Types of generation, generations changing, battery storage is some things that we've talked about, and make sure that we fairly review those impacts as well. So with that, we just want to vote. No, just kidding. But what we really would like to do is host a couple public open houses, get some public opinion, give you guys time to think about what we just threw at you in an hour that took us almost a year to put this together, right? So we would like to, hopefully today achieve that we could get 2 public open houses, one on November 14th and one on December 5th is what we'd like to do, just to start getting this out and start hearing, and getting everybody's input on these recommendations. So that is what we would like to achieve. And then also we'd like to open it up for, is there anything that we've missed that we should be studying? I would like to write down the list from your guys' comments and open it up to the floor to make sure. I know, Alan, I'm going to kind of let you spell out some things here, but if there's anything else that we've missed, then I would like to give you guys a chance to let us know what we should be looking at as well. So
I don't necessarily have a comment about anything that was missed, but I just wanted to say that in my 10 years on the council, I don't know that I've ever received a clearer presentation on a really complicated issue. I mean, of all the discussions we've had about solar and impact and costs and justifying increases, this is the first time that I've been done with one that I'm like, I get it, and it makes sense, and so it was flawlessly done. All of your efforts in the last year and the presentation today, I think you have defied the odds by getting a group of experts together and effectively explaining it to lay people. And I think that's really one of the hardest things we see. So I just wanted to say very, very, very well done.
Well, thank you. We definitely appreciate it, and it takes that passion, right? And I can tell you that, just to add to that, everybody has that passion. So we definitely appreciate that.
Hey, just a question before we move on. One of and I too appreciate the work. I just know that the electrical grid and the things that we're going to be it's going to affect us in the future. We're in a dynamic state, and things are going to change. I remember a think tank was talking. They said that the high usage in the future will actually change, and the peak usage in the average power grid will actually occur during night, where now it's the lowest, and it's because of all the electrical cars coming on and everybody charging at night. That's actually going to be the peak. And so, I mean, what a dynamic that'll be. And I appreciate it. Just asking you, when we talk about the eventual time of use rates, when we can actually monitor them, do we have any idea when that would actually take place? Do we know when that technology is going to be there where we can monitor that kind of stuff?
So yeah, and again, Bruce, feel free to jump in on this. But
the AMI is implemented and online, it's capable of that.
So right now,
it's capable now, and we're probably, if we approve an AMI system, we're within a couple of years.
Okay.
So I believe
I can actually see a bit, and I guess here's the question that I have for example, I have a neighbor that's big into solar, and he is purchasing these batteries from Tesla, and you know, his whole goal is to get off the grid. But the point is if he's able to store and to push a lot of that energy back on the grid during the peak hour, and if there's enough customers doing that, I could see where that could be actually a benefit, you know, to Kaysville City, to our power, and things like this. You know, right now it's kind of a detriment in a lot of ways, you know, and I know when you have that bus, you have to figure it full. I mean, it's not like if we don't use that power, we can just store it over here in space and then it comes back. It just doesn't work that way. So I guess the question is down the road, I just don't get too comfortable, because I think we're going to need your advice down the road a lot. And I think that this isn't like we do it and, hey, we're fixed for 10 years, we can all take a break. But I have a feeling that that's not going to be the case. So I appreciate very much the work all of you have done.
Yeah, and just one quick comment. For the open houses, you're all welcome to come on the council if you want to be there when people give their comments, or if you want to hear any of that during that time. Of course, the commission will take notes and report back to the council with what the findings are from those open houses. I just hope that we get a good response back from the public. We really need the input, and then we can, once we get that all together, then we can decide how we want to proceed.
Do we have a schedule for when those are? Do we have those already on the calendar, already set up?
November 14th and December 5th.
Okay.
Yeah, and everyone in the city will get a mailer, a little postcard, a yellow one, is that what I heard?
Yellow, yes.
A bright yellow one. So hopefully they won't miss it, and they'll know when to come.
Okay, I'm not sure everybody heard that. November 14th and December 5th, and that'll be here?
Yes.
What time?
At 6 p.m.
6 p.m., both of those evenings, so an opportunity for everybody to come and make comment. I'll just echo what everyone has already commented. That obviously, you guys have been working for a very long time, putting a lot of effort into this, so thank you for the time, the extra time away from home. It's a good thing you're passionate about it, because you'd have to be to spend that kind of time to do it, so thank you.
Yeah.
Since you offered requests, first and foremost, again, and thank you to the board. It's pretty cool what you guys have done. Thank you, Gary, for your leadership in it and your knowledge of it also, and your input. By way of requests, I know that tonight the focus was probably primarily solar, because that's such a huge topic right now in the whole world of energy. And the only things I'm curious about is how we stack up against Rocky Mountain Power. I see that a lot. From constituents and from citizens. You know, sometimes they feel like we're more, less, whatever. That'd be great, you know, when you guys have the time. I'm not saying for these open houses, unless you have the time, that'd be sweet. But in the future of your board, if we could see studies like that, I think that would be super beneficial for us. And then in the future of your board, it would be great to get some kind of an assessment of the value of our company. If you guys could, you know, Gary, if you guys could spearhead that, give us an idea of the total assessed value, what perhaps the market value of our company would be. Those would be two things on the top of my mind that, as I get feedback from citizenry. So I think that would be helpful to them. And thanks again for all the work you put into it. Nice presentation.
I'll just join the other council members in saying thank you, and I think it's been pretty well covered, so I don't have anything else to add at this point in time. Look forward to future and considering it, open houses, and considering it in December. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. We
Thank you
appreciate
very
it.
much. And those of you that are just joining us at 6 p.m., we convened a Power Commission presentation. We had wonderful representatives from our Power Commission here talking to us about solar rates and regular rates. We're going to convene our City Council meeting, but we're going to take just a few minute break, so we will convene at 7:05 p.m.